So today, once we get over my hangover, we're going to be talking about some migration strategies for migrating from Vault, a self-hosted Vault, to a HCP managed Vault. So just in case you missed the stream last week, we took a bit of a deep dive into HCP Vault. We looked at what it was, how it works, some of the concepts behind it, how to get up and running, and just some gotchas and limitation. It was a really interactive chat with a lot of experience being shared by the community, which was really good. If you missed it, I'm just going to post the link in the chat to the recording, which is live on YouTube at the moment. So I'll just post that there. Feel free to share it with your friends. It's actually a whole playlist of Vault Brown Bag sessions, so if you've missed any of them, you will be able to go back in time and view them. But it's always nice if you can join live, because then you can get involved in the chat and you can share your experiences and learn from one another, which is great. So let's crack on, I guess. Time is of the essence. I haven't had lunch, so we need to get through this so that I don't upset my wife with something I said while I was hungry. Anyway, so migration strategies. So I guess there's a few things we kind of want to point out from the get-go, right? So in terms of how to migrate from a self-hosted Vault to a HCP Vault, the main things that you're looking at migrating are your static secrets firstly, so things that you have stored in KV secrets engine, and then you're going to want to migrate your secrets engines over. When we say migrate your secrets engine, what we want to do is we pretty much want to replicate the configuration of these secrets engines that you have in the self-hosted Vault to the HCP managed Vault. And then we've got a whole bunch of roles, right? The secrets engine are just part of the story, but the roles are what is going to define what permissions get assigned to any generated credentials. So, for example, if you have the AWS secrets engine, the role is going to determine which AWS IAM policies are going to be assigned to that credential that is generated by Vault. So you need to migrate these things over, right? And then in terms of how you're going to access these secrets, so be it generate a secret from the key value store, or generate something from the actual secrets engines like the AWS example, you're going to need some policies, right? So you probably would have some policies already in your self-hosted Vault, so you're going to want to migrate those things over, as well as your authentication methods. So you more than likely would have some type of identity provider, maybe Active Directory or GitHub or Okta or whatever it is your organization is using. And that is how people are going to authenticate to Vault. So you're going to need to migrate that configuration over to the HCP managed Vault as well, right? And then finally, cryptographic keys, which for me is by far the most complex one to do, right? So if you have the transit secrets engine enabled and configured, and you've created keys within there that your applications are using to encrypt and decrypt application data, well, your applications are really reliant on that now, and they're not going to be able to function without these keys. So when you talk about migrating your applications which rely on these things from one Vault to the next, what you're doing is you're trying to migrate these cryptographic keys. And that's not so straightforward with Vault, because by default, the keys are not exportable, right? So what you can do is you can actually make the keys exportable just with a configuration change, and you can export the keys and then bring them into the new Vault, technically speaking. But the drawback with that is once you do that, once you make a key exportable, that action is irreversible. I think we actually had a question on the discuss.hashicorp.com forum a few weeks back, which we answered on live stream about this type of operation. So just in case you comes out of session, that's the point. You can't reverse that. So once it's exportable, that's it. It's out there, right? So if that doesn't really work with your security posture, then you're going to need to figure out a strategy of how you can create some new keys in the new vault and how you can migrate your application data, your encrypted application data from one vault to the other, right? So you're probably going to have to do something where you decrypt the data and then re-encrypt it. So you're going to have to do some smart scripting somewhere so that the new data that's stored in your data store, so be it database or whatever it is going to be housing your ciphertext using the new cryptographic keys. And I just see a comment from Guy. PKI is pretty difficult as well for the same reason, but you can't export the private keys. Exactly. So these things are really, really challenging. So you kind of need to be aware of this from the jump. You know, I can remember the first time I attempted to even think about a migration. I thought it was going to be pretty straightforward and simple, and just a few bash scripts would solve the issues. But when you kind of peel the layers back, you actually realized how deeply coupled your applications and your systems are with something like Vault. And the security posture of Vault means that certain things, like in Guy's example, the private key, you can't export that, and that's a security mechanism. You know, if you could export the private key, then I guess it's a bit of an attack vector. So we need to be aware of those things there. Right. So now we kind of know what the components are that we need to migrate. There's a couple of paths that we should consider, right? So you could be coming from the open source world. So you could be self-hosting an open source vault. So your path to migration is one thing, right? It can be a lift and shift approach if you want. Almost everything that's available to you in open source Vault will be available to you in HCP Vault. And then same for enterprise, right? So again, that can be a lift and shift approach, but there are some caveats that we need to be aware of if this is what we want to do. So firstly, replication it's not available at the moment, right? So if you have any kind of fancy kind of setup where you're having performance replicas, or I don't know, whatever your architecture is for replication, you're not going to be able to do that with HCP Vault. Those endpoints are switched off deliberately, right? So you need to be aware of that. That might not be so much of an issue, to be fair, because a lot of the reason why you would do replication is primarily for disaster recovery. So you have your data backed up. But I believe that's kind of HashiCorp's responsibility to make sure that the data is backed up. And secondly, performance replication is generally speaking about, well, it's in the name, performance, right? So you may want to set up multiple vaults and they replicate to each other so that applications and principals can contact its nearest vault to reduce the latency, right? So you just have to be aware of that. The second thing that you need to be aware of is Sentinel, right? So if you have Sentinel policies as part of your Vault implementation to restrict certain things or just enforce certain security postures that your organization has, Sentinel is not available in HCP, right? Which, you know, is probably a little bit disappointing to some of you. So you're going to need to be aware of this, that if you have Vault self-hosted and you want to move to that, just be aware that if you're relying on Sentinel policies to restrict certain actions, those restrictions are not going to be possible at the moment. All you have available to you is the ACL policies, so the standard Vault policies. And finally, your disaster recovery strategy will need to be redesigned, right? So like I say, you probably have, I don't know, maybe a disaster recovery replication set up where you have another cluster somewhere which the data is sent over there, and then in a disaster scenario you would fail over to the DR cluster. It's not really required, I guess. this time around, because in terms of your data always being available, as I say, that's one of the things that HashiCorp will take care of for you. So you need to kind of look at your disaster recovery strategy and figure out from your side of the responsibility, what things do you need to be aware of? And with these things, how can you redesign a strategy and test this strategy to ensure that should an incident happen, you are best placed to be able to react to it, right? So just some things to be aware of. So those are the two paths, right? Now, regardless of what path you're taking, whether you're coming from enterprise or you're coming from open source, right? Migration it's a great opportunity. Sorry, I got the dry throat again. Too much talking. So migration is an opportunity, right? If there's ever a time that you're going to change the implementation of your vault, it will be when you're migrating to a new vault, right? So planning for migration is the perfect opportunity to change anything in the way that your vault is not only deployed, but how you also manage it on a day-to-day basis, right? Also, you have to be aware that if you're coming from open source to HCP, in general, the path from open source to enterprise is about scaling your business, right? So a lot of businesses can start with the open source version of Vault, and as your business scales, so do your requirements, right? And so do things like you need some of the audit and compliance capabilities of enterprise, or more importantly, maybe you're in a regulated industry and they require some kind of segregation of secrets that your applications can access. So things like namespaces, right? So as your organization scales, you more than likely would move to something like enterprise, right? So rather than having to roll out a self-hosted enterprise vault, there's a good way to kind of dip your toes into the water here, because as we know from last week's session, HCP Vault is built off the back of Vault Enterprise, right? So if you are in a position where you're thinking about scaling your Vault alongside your business, this is probably a good time to do something like that without having to take on the extra overhead, right? So some of the things that I like to kind of talk about when it comes to migration, right? So like I say, there's an opportunity here. And I think to just go ahead and take the Vault that you have and then try to replicate that in HCP Vault is okay for some use cases. But in general, I think you should go through something which I like to call a secrets management roadmap. This is just something that I kind of came up with in conjunction with some other consultants that I worked with for a previous client. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen because it's going to be quite easy for me to draw this out. But there's a few things that I think that we should really be going through before we make any solid decisions on what a migration looks like, right? Give me a sec. Oh, is it not broadcasting? Oh, it is. Okay. Let's just start a new session. Okay, all right, I'll just switch my screen. And cool. Right, so like I call this a secrets management roadmap. I don't really have a better name for it. I'm not really great at making up names, but there are a few phases that I kind of want to detail out here, right? So the first phase is what I like to call the discovery phase, right? So okay, so in this phase, what you really want to do, and this is probably the consultant in me speaking, right? But you want to identify how teams are currently using Vault, right? You want to understand the developer workflows that they're going through, and you want to identify the bottlenecks in the processes that they follow, right? Now, this is key because in my experience, the path to adoption is all about developer experience when it comes to security products, right? Like security is hard. It's really, really hard. And developers just need to be able to get on with their jobs and develop. And what we need to do is try to make implementing security processes as simple as possible for them to adopt without it causing them pain and friction, right? So you want to know how they're using Vault. So that could be things like what secrets engines they're using. It could be, how they're authenticating their applications, whatever it is, right? This will differ from team to team, application to application, organization to organization, right? So you want to understand these things, right? So how you can go about doing that, you can employ a number of techniques, and this is probably more my wife's field, because some of the techniques that you would use are business analysis techniques. So you can do things like holding workshops, and in these workshops you can bring a group of these teams together, just to kind of understand what these shared requirements are. You can conduct interviews with these teams. So I like to start off with that a lot of the time, where I can just kind of isolate a team without any influence from any other teams, and just try to understand exactly what it is they need from Vault, understand what's frustrating them, because sometimes what's frustrating them might not necessarily be Vault, but it could be how another team is using Vault. So it's just quite good to get all this information without kind of influence from other teams, right? And then the other thing you can do is shadow them through key points of their software development lifecycle, right? So when you're shadowing them, you can kind of take notice of the things that are frustrating them. You can kind of see the processes they're going through. And in your mind, you can kind of build the process map yourself, right? Another key part of this phase, in my opinion, is identifying the key stakeholders, right? So, you want to know who's using Vault. You want to know who's not using Vault and why they're not using Vault. And also you want to know who the influential voices are within the organization, right? Because if you're going to roll out something like this, people are going to have to be on board with what you're doing, right? So identifying those key stakeholders early is absolutely key. In terms of requirements gathering as well, we tend to put a lot of focus on teams that are using Vault for secrets management, i.e. development teams whose applications are reliant on these things. And, just in general principles that maybe for break fix reasons, they need to get a credential to access the back end of something and so on and so forth, right? But what you can't overlook in this phase is the security requirements of your organization for Vault, right? So it's a good idea to conduct some type of preliminary threat modeling exercise with your security teams, right? So this is where you can kind of incorporate what the organization's security posture is in whatever design you come up with next, right? And the other thing that you will kind of notice during this phase is there will normally be a team or a group of individuals who are more enthusiastic about this than the others, right? So I'm going to call them advocates, right? So you want to kind of identify who they are, because these people are going to be key in anything that you try to do going forward, right? Now, before I continue on to the next phase, I think we have a comment from Guy, so let's check this out. So now we need a special guest stream with Mrs. DevOps Rob to share her experience. She said, Guy, let me tell you something. I said to her last night as I was thinking about this, I said, do you want to come on the stream? Because you can talk about some of these techniques that you employ in your work. And she was like, nope, hard nope. Don't worry, I'm working on it, Guy. Just give me time. Give me time. She sat there smiling, shaking her head, saying, nah, it's not happening. But all joking aside, Guy, you make a good point, right? I'm not a business analyst, I'm a consultant, and, experience has taught me how to ask the right questions with things like this. But had I had a business analyst, and obviously it helps that I'm married to one as well. So, naturally you pick up things when you're around these types of people. But in general, if you have access to a business analyst, this phase, in fact, this whole roadmap becomes so much simpler to implement effectively, right? And as I go through it, it will probably make a bit more sense. But these are definitely business analysis techniques that are really, really useful that I've employed at several customers and had great success with identifying a lot of these things here, right? So, like I say, I call that the discovery phase, right? So the next phase would be the design phase, right? So now you want to design Vault, right? Now, this is equally as key, right? What you've done, you've captured all the requirements, and the first thing you want to do is you want to look at all these requirements for all these different teams, and then you want to identify what the common requirements are across the teams, right? And we're talking about things like your identity and access management definitions, the secrets engines requirements, common roles, namespace requirements, how teams and developers will interact with Vault, both for secrets retrieval and adding things to Vault, and even just the management of Vault itself, right? You want to identify what the common themes are. Now, before I continue, as soon as I see DevOps Adil come up, I know that he's got gold. So let me just read this. So InfoSec will want disk encryption when you ask them what the use case is. They will need to respond with disk encryption. If the real use case is encrypting sensitive data at rest, then there are other options like Vault Transit. Correct, right? But the point is, you need to identify these things up front, right? Before you start drawing any triangles or squares or spiking anything or writing any code, you want to identify what is it that people want from these things, right? And before I even continue, the reason why I feel this is so important is because generally speaking, I see this pattern when it comes to Vault adoption. People normally maybe go to a conference or something like that and they hear about Vault and they say, oh, okay, it looks really cool, we should try it out. So then they come back and then they do a proof of concept, and that's all good, right? It gets sign off from whoever it is and needs sign off for, and then that person gets told, well, how can you make this ready for production? And then they go through some tweaking and so on and so forth. And next thing you know, it's declared fit for production, right? And then if you know how you're using Vault and your application is integrating with it, now what you have is kind of scaling issues, right? But a lot of people don't even know exactly what to do with Vault once they get it, right? So you have this kind of day 2 implementation. This is where someone like DevOps Adil comes in. He really helps people out with that day 2 part of their journey, right? So the point is, in general, a lot of people will kind of set up a secrets management platform and either they don't set it up correctly according to what their organization actually requires, or they have set it up correctly. However, since they've set it up, the organization and its use has scaled, and now it isn't functioning in the way that is required, right? So, it's quite important before you do any type of migration just to kind of identify these things and then try to put it right at the best possible time. And I think when you're migrating from one Vault to the other, there's nothing like a clean slate that's going to assist you here, right? Let's continue reading in the comments. Asking the right questions is key. Exactly, right? Exactly. Which I feel like experience for someone like me is why I have been able to ask the right questions, because I've asked a lot of wrong questions and had a lot of miscommunications over the years and learned from that. But in general, business analysts are very, very skilled people. They know how to extract the right information to make the right decisions for the organization. So, I guess being a consultant when you're dealing with something like this, you kind of do become a bit of a business analyst somewhat, right? Let's see, Guy. So while walking along a desert sand, you suddenly look down and see a tortoise crawling towards you. You reach down and flip it over onto its back. The tortoise lies there, its belly baking in the hot sun, beating its legs, trying to turn itself over, but it cannot do so without your help. You're not helping. Why? I love this. This is Guy for you. Everyone, meet Guy. If you don't know Guy, give him a follow. See, these questions actually are deeper than what it seems when you start to think about it like that, right? You have to ask the right questions. Why? I love it. All right, so carrying on. So like I say, you want to design solutions which cover the majority of the team's use cases, right? What I mean by that is you want to identify the patterns. So if you have, say, 10 teams, and of those 10 teams, 7 need pretty much the same things, then your designs should probably take a templated approach, right? Which means that out of the box, you support certain things from a templated point of view, which is going to cover majority of the use cases for the 7 teams, right? And then the other 3 teams, we will call those edge cases. So you want to be very clear what kind of falls into your supported parameters and what classifies as an edge case, right? And you have to realize that you can identify all these things up front, but as your organization evolves, you know, these things are going to change. You're going to get new edge cases that are going to come up. You're going to get new, sometimes they're not even going to be edge cases. Sometimes you're going to have new requirements that are common across the board, which you're going to have to include in your templated approach, right? So just understand what will be considered as a bespoke solution, tailor-made for edge cases, and what you're going to support as part of a templated approach, right? And I think one kind of key thing to kind of look at here is when you're creating a templated approach, you don't want to kind of throw everything in there that, you know, majority of the teams don't need, because it can cause confusion, and, you know, these types of confusing things can create barriers to adoption, right? So you want to kind of give people what it is that they need. And the fact you have namespaces there kind of gives you the ability to separate these things there. So it's almost as if each team or each application can have its own vault, right? That's kind of the way to look at a namespace, right? And the other thing that you want to do is, as you're designing your vault implementation, right, you want to document these things quite publicly, right? And when I say publicly, I mean within your organization. You want to make sure that your stakeholders and teams are aware of where this documentation are, and that they're constantly reviewing it, right? Because this is where that kind of DevOps feedback cycle is so key. You want to iterate over your designs as many times as required. You want to obtain constant feedback from the stakeholders, because you can interpret requirements as one thing, right? But when you start to put a design down on paper and you think you're addressing those requirements, you need to be sure that what you're doing actually is fit for purpose in terms of that, right? So definitely documenting that, obtaining constant feedback is key, right? And then once you've got to the point where you've iterated over your design as much as you need to, right? As much as you've got people who seem to be happy with it, it's always good to obtain sign off from these key stakeholders and teams, right? You kind of want them to say, we are happy with this design. We're happy for you to go forward with it. And especially with a templated approach, as long as your 7 out of your 10 teams are happy with that templated approach, I think you're pretty good to go, right? So, oops, sorry, my iPad's gone off again. Let me just move to just chatting. Give me a sec. And I'll figure this out. Give me 1 second. Okie doke. Right, okay, so we are back. Okay, cool. So you've now gone through your design phase, right? The next thing you kind of want to do, which I find is key and a lot of people miss this out, is I just call it pipeline design for lack of a better kind of phrase. But you want to design a pipeline, right? And what I mean by this is you need to configure your vault in a before I even continue. DevOps do, I know you're dropping gold. Let's go through the comments. Let's pause for a second. So Vault namespaces allow enterprise to use Vault Terraform modules against their own namespaces, reducing the blast radius, thus allowing for self-service. But the challenge is the balance between self-service and developers wanting to really keep their focus on their dev work. This ties back to understanding the ecosystem. Exactly. And I think this is almost tying into what I'm about to talk about next, right? So very good point, DevOps deal. So we talk about pipeline design here, right? And what I mean by that is, generally speaking, you need to configure Vault, but you want to do it in a way that is managed, right? You want to do it in a controlled fashion. And that means that code is normally a really good approach, you know. There's a reason why infrastructure as code is such a big hit when it comes to configuring cloud environments. So you can use techniques like that when it comes to managing your Vault as well, right? So in general, you're going to need to go from code into configuration of Vault itself. And a pipeline is normally a good mechanism for how to do that. So as this is going to be quite an integral part of how your designs get implemented, right? You're going to need to design things like branching strategies, right? You're going to need to understand how that's going to work. It's normally wise when your applications are reliant on something like Vault to have multiple environments. So you're normally going to want, just for argument's sake, development, staging, and prod. So if you're going to have multiple environments, you're going to need to have a mechanism to promote configuration from environments. So it can start off in development, and then once it goes through certain things, it can be promoted to staging and then finally out into production, right? So you need some kind of promotion strategy, and that would differ from one organization to the next, right? And then you've got things like quality gates. So what are your quality gates? Like when you're deploying your Vault configuration to Vault itself, like what checks are you going through and how does it get past a certain point in the pipeline? You want to design all of these things up front, right? And you'd be surprised how many people implement Vault and don't have anything like this, but it's so key. You then need some kind of testing strategy, right? You want to test that the configuration is doing what you intend it to do, right? Now that's not so straightforward. I don't really believe there's anything out of the box available to do that. I know some people that developed internal kind of behavior driven tests for Vault policies, for example, to check that the policies are actually doing the things that they intended it to do. You know, whatever testing looks like to your organization, you're going to have to figure it out. The point is, we need to think about these things before we start writing any code, right? And then we need to think about who owns the pipeline, which can be key in some scenarios, and pipeline security and code integrity. So things like code owners, or when code is committed to a repo, are you doing like sign-in of commits and those types of things there? You just want to be aware of all of these types of things. So you want to design what a pipeline looks like and all the processes surrounding it. You probably saw the business analyst walk past me that way. So you've got to pipeline design. Once you've done that, now you're at the point, and remember, try to get this signed off as well by the stakeholders as well, because they are going to have a big say in how this works, right? So once you've done that, now you're at the implementation phase, and the business analyst returns, right? And she leaves again. Right. So you're at the implementation phase. So what I mean by that is, you know, I heavily advocate for the use of Terraform when it comes to configuring your Vault. So in general, what I'm talking about in this implementation phase is creating Terraform modules, right? So like I say, it's easier to modularize these things here and template them so that anytime something is needed, you could just not have to rewrite the code. You can just take this module and just fill out a bunch of parameters, almost like filling out a form, and then it will go ahead and do that for you, right? Implementation phase is, you know, dare I say, straightforward, right? If you do the discovery phase and the design phase correctly and you're obtaining the right feedback, generally speaking, just your documentation is the structure for your modules, right? It's literally translating that document into Terraform code. And it's a lot easier to do that than it is to just go ahead and start trying to write some Terraform, thinking you understand this, that, and the third, and then it gets very, very tricky, right? So there's not really much to say on the implementation phase. I think that we try to make our lives easier there, right? Now, our next phase is application onboarding. Right? Now, application onboarding is, this is where you're in it for the long haul, right? So remember I said in the discovery phase that you want to identify people that are more enthusiastic about these things, like either teams or just a group of people that are more enthusiastic. And the reason why I said that is because these people are going to become your internal advocates for Vault, and they're going to be very key in ensuring the success of any deployment, right? So you want to identify who could be an early adopter. So it's one thing to kind of figure out who's really enthusiastic about it, but it's also another thing to figure out who has a good use case, which is good to try out as an early adoption test, right? So in general, the way that I like to go about it is because I have Terraform, it's literally a case of using this code to create a localized development environment, which I can just hand to the team to test, right? So I can use things like Docker. More recently, I'm using things like Shipyard. And I can literally take my Terraform code and implement it against this local development environment, right? Looking for early adopters, building a silent majority. Exactly. I'm telling you, it's so key. This is not even about Vault, like this is, if you're going to implement anything, right? Adoption is key. So you need these early adopters and you need them to be on side. And the only way for them to be on side is for them to be happy, right? So by giving them this localized version of the Vault implementation to test out, what you're now in a position to do is obtain real tangible feedback, right? So what you've been doing during the design phase is kind of documenting what a design could look like. And it's still kind of an interpretation, right? So people will look at designs and interpret it as different things. And you can iterate that over that as many times as you want, and people still have an interpretation, right? But interpretation versus reality can, in some cases, be two totally separate things. So for me, giving them something tangible that they can actually try and take a development version of their application and use this development version of the Vault implementation to test, you're now in a position to obtain actual feedback, right? And when you get this feedback, if things are not quite working for them, like you need to kind of adjust your designs and sometimes your implementation, but if you're kind of doing a templated approach, you want to be careful about adjusting your designs without buy-in from the rest of the teams, right? However, your job becomes a bit easier because as you're adjusting these things, not only are you advocating for this, but you have a team who's going to be happy with it because you're giving them something that's easy for them to use, and they are going to advocate for it within the organization. And more than just advocate for it, they can actually help people adopt it, right? And help them use these things, right? So once you kind of got this feedback and you're quite happy with the way that's looking, now you're at the point where you can onboard a single application from this team to HCP Vault, right? Now, the reason why I say a single application is because through any migration, no matter what you're migrating from or to, be it an on-premise data center into a cloud or whatever it is, there are huge risks associated with that, right? And a good way to mitigate some of these risks is to make sure that you have resources dedicated to managing that migration and resolving any issues that may come up during the migration, right? So you want to onboard a single application with this team. So it'll be all hands on deck with your Vault team and your development team. And you want to go through this and ensure that there are no issues and that it's working for them exactly as is required, right? And then once you've kind of gone through this cycle, then, you want to go through this application by application, team by team. And this is what I mean. You're in it for the long haul. It's not going to be a big bang approach, right? I think doing the big bang approach, some organizations may choose to do that, but it involves huge risks, right? My iPad's gone off again. Let me just fix that. I need to turn off the sleep when I'm doing live streams, right? You're essentially helping application developers improving their security posture, thus deploying secure, compliant deployments, shift left security. Exactly that, right? Exactly that. It's so key. It's so key. Like I say, I've made mistakes myself where I haven't done these things, and it always comes back to bite you, right? So that's what the onboarding application looks like. And, you're going through this cycle and it could take many weeks or months, just depending on how big your organization is and the amount of applications and teams that you have to go through, right? So you want to kind of communicate these things out as early as possible with rough timescales so that teams can plan resources, right? You're going to want their developers available to assist with the migration from a development standpoint, just so that you can go through this, right? And it's also good when you're onboarding teams. just to, we've gone through this thing about giving them a localized development environment. Sometimes when you move on to the next team, it's kind of good to do the same thing again, right? Just so that they know exactly what they're walking into and they're not kind of finding out things when you're live in production on HCP Vault, right? They've run into certain things, you're able to resolve it with them. And again, if required, you can adjust the design and the implementation, obtaining buy-in from the rest of the stakeholders, right? So the next thing you want to do is you want to go through another threat modeling exercise, right? And the reason is, what you've done when you were doing the discovery phase is you've spoken to security, right? And you've gathered the security requirements. You've gone through some kind of preliminary threat modeling exercise, right? But it's not based on anything tangible. It's nothing that you can actually look at and see and test and feel, right? But with applications onboarded, now you have something that, you can revisit your threat model and you can do it again with applications that are actually there. So, based on this, you can then implement things like controls and processes, right? So there's a few different things, a few different versions of controls and processes that you can implement. And you've got things like detective controls, right? So if certain events are to happen, how do you detect that they've happened, right? So you can implement things to pick up, like if someone generated a root token, for example, which is pretty easily done inside HCP Vault because of the way that IAM works for HCP itself, right? So you need to kind of manage that. Then you have preventative controls, right? So in general, things like policies can play a part here, but there are so many different ways to prevent things from happening, which is why I can understand some people are a little bit disappointed that there's no Sentinel support at the moment. But that may or may not come in the future. I can't commit to that. But you still want ways to put in some type of preventative controls based on the output of your threat modeling exercise, right? And then you need corrective controls. So should something happen, so should the configuration, for example, change from what it should be, how do you automatically correct that back to what it should be, right? So the thing that comes to mind, firstly, is something like a GitOps workflow. I'm not necessarily saying that's the way to go. It's just an example. So you want a way to ensure that if anything changes from the way it's supposed to be, that it can correct itself in an automated fashion, right? Now, moving on from that, then what you've got is, I like to call this the target operating model. I stole this term from an old colleague of mine called Sunil. He's a really good consultant. And we worked on a project together. He was working for a consultancy, and I was an independent consultant, and we kind of came together for a client, right? And he came up with this term, target operating model, which I really liked. Now, what we mean by this is it's all about continuous improvement, right? So essentially, what we're doing here is we are looking at our Vault deployment. We're making sure that it still works for our teams. We're constantly obtaining feedback. This is why DevOps is so important when it comes to this kind of things here, because a key thing for me when it comes to DevOps is that constant feedback cycle. You've always got to be obtaining feedback. You've got to be listening and learning, right? So you can design these things all you want. You can implement it all you want, but things change, people change, organizations change, right? And as these things evolve, so too must your Vault designs and implementations. So you want to get this feedback. You want to identify where new bottlenecks are coming up, right? In terms of bottlenecks, let me give you an example. There was an organization that I did some work for once that a decision was made at one point to configure Vault using Ansible, right? And at the time it had it all implemented. It was all good, right? I think runs maybe used to take like 10, 15 minutes maximum, and they could have new configuration deployed to the production Vault in that time space, right? But then what happened is the organization grew, and with it, the applications grew, and with it, the policies grew, the usage of things grew. Like just the general code base just went from, I don't know, a few hundred lines to thousands of lines, right? So now what used to be a 10 to 15 minute deployment was now taking an hour and a half, right? So it's one of those things that could only be run a few times a day as well. So now what you're in a situation where there's a clear bottleneck, right? And, in this organization's case, waiting for it to get to a point where deployments are taking an hour and a half plus is, you want to try and avoid that. Like if you can see things are gradually creeping up in this example, for example, like you want to be able to react to that and say, okay, cool. Maybe something like Ansible isn't the best fit for this because it's quite an imperative type of tool. It's always going to run through a configuration. The other thing is it's high risk as well because, it's always going to try to change everything according to what's written inside that. So it's trying to do these things rather than be a bit more declarative where you have state and where it will change things according to drift, right? So it's a bit more high risk. So you want to identify these bottlenecks and you want to understand when the business is scaling past the current designs. And essentially what you want to do as part of the target operating model is you want to repeat this roadmap all over again, right? So code to scale, exactly, right? This is why, I love Ansible. I've, at the beginning of my DevOps career, it was my go-to tool for a lot of things. But, I try to not have vendor loyalty, right? I try to look at the problem ahead of me and choose the right tools and the right workflows to solve that problem. So for me, Ansible is not a good fit if you're looking to scale. I think just for this organization, particularly that you used Ansible at the time when they implemented it, like I say, a 10 to 15 minute deployment is perfectly fine to go through all your different environments and get in there. But an hour and a half is just not feasible, right? So like I say, when you're migrating from a self-hosted Vault to HCP Vault, highly recommend going through a process like this, right? But the key thing that I want you to take away from this is ultimately when you're migrating, you are probably going to be running 2 vaults side by side for a period of time, right? So you remember the application onboarding phase where I said you're going to onboard a single application and you're going to take this approach app by app, team by team, right? So you can say for this week, you're dedicating all your resources to onboarding a particular application, right? And you have the Vault team, or I just call them the Vault team, whatever your organization structure is. The people responsible for Vault, they're going to be available to do this, and the development teams responsible for the application are going to be available to do this. And you're going to go through this week by week. And if you've got 1,000 applications, right, you just have to realize that you're going to be running 2 vaults side by side. And the good thing about that is 100 applications. Well, applications on microservices, right? There's some pretty tricky architectures that I've seen in my time. Yeah, like I said, the point, you're going to be running these 2 things. So for a period of time, the overhead is going to be a bit increased, right? And you have to be ready for that. You're now going to be looking after the HCP Vault as well as the self-hosted Vault. But the good thing is, should something go wrong and it can't be resolved quickly, you can easily revert your configuration just to point back to the self-hosted Vault, which we know works, right? So then that way you have time to kind of regroup, assess what's gone wrong, and then come again. And then the idea is once all of your applications are onboarded to the HCP Vault, you're in a strong position to be able to say, we are happy to switch off the self-hosted Vault, right? And then you now don't have this responsibility of managing all of that, and you can save some costs there, right? So these are the key things that I want you to take away from that. And with that, we're almost coming up at time. So I'm going to read comments and I'm just going to put it out there. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them in the chat. I've probably got another 5 minutes or so before we're going to call this session, right? But I think the things that I've outlined are really important if you're going through any kind of secrets management platform migration, or even if you're deploying something greenfield, right? You know, if a customer comes to me now and says, hey, Rob, can you deploy Vault? I'm not going to do the things that I used to do in the past where I literally just deploy a Vault and just leave them with it, right? I'm going to go through this entire roadmap just to make sure that the thing that I give them is in fact the right thing, right? That they can manage by themselves, right? You're going to want to know who's owning Vault, right? Who's responsible for what parts. Things like namespaces, for example, especially if you're coming from open source to enterprise, this is going to be a mentality shift for you. So generally speaking, you might have a model which we call the delegated administrator model, by which I mean within your development teams, you're going to have someone who is your delegated administrator, and they are going to administer the permissions for that particular namespace. So if a new developer joins that team and they need to onboard certain things, it wouldn't be the centralized Vault team, if you like, that's managing that. It would be your delegated administrator. However, the centralized Vault team are the experts, and they are there to assist in any way that they can. So the key thing about the delegated administrator model, which if you're going to implement that, now's a good time to start doing this, is training, right? And what I mean by training is not sending people just on a course, right? That's too short-sighted. A course can be good, right? But ultimately, you want to, like your early adopters, for example, who are going to be your advocates. These people are always going to be learning things themselves. They're going to be enthusiastic about it and do a lot of learning by themselves. So if you have like an internal blog, they can share their learnings within that. They can, pair with other teams to help them onboard certain things or tweak certain things or rewrite applications that include certain logic or whatever it is, right? You want to do a lot of peer-to-peer learning as well. And the other thing you want to do is, if you are going to go down a route of training courses as well, you definitely want to keep doing refresher training courses. The frequency is going to be up to your organization. It could be every 6 months, it could be every year, right? But anyone who has to do anything concerning Vault should be competent enough to be able to write applications that interact with it or manage Vault directly itself. Maybe you're doing a self-managed model like Adil mentioned in the chat. They're going to need to know exactly how to do this. So your training could be bespoke, where you kind of set up your own training course internally to say, this is how you can get changes inside Vault. You maybe got a, create a pull request against this repo and whatever it is, right? You want to train people so they understand the process. They know where to go for certain things. And your Vault team can, be there to assist all of these teams here so that they can assist themselves, essentially, right? You want to enable them, right? So the overhead is high at the beginning, but then it should be incrementally repeatable. Exactly, right? So that's my point about this roadmap is it's not easy to undertake something like this to start off with, right? But as time goes on, it gets easier, right? Because firstly, you get into a cycle, right? So not only are you as architects used to this, but your stakeholders are used to this. They know that every so often, they're going to be called in for interviews to find out how things are going, or they're going to get requests for members of the Vault team to shadow them during some, software release or something like that, whatever it is, right? They're going to be used to these cycles, and it's going to get easier on them. It's going to get easier on you. And once you get to the point where everything is onboarded anyway, right, you're now only managing the HCP Vault, which a lot of that overhead, the Vault team don't need to take care of that anymore because HashiCorp is going to do that for you, right? So that is a key thing. But on that, we're hitting the hour. I don't see any questions in the chat. There's been some really, really good comments. While we're here, let's just quickly click on some links that DevOps Adil has sent in the chat. Let's post this here and see what these links are. Right, let's share my screen, desktop. Okay, so this first link, this ties back to understanding the ecosystem. So what do we have here? So we have Terraform Vault's secret transit. So this looks like a Terraform module, or is it? Oh no, it looks like you've written a Ruby application or something like that, or some kind of configuration to configure Vault. It looks like actually it's an onboarding thing, so it creates. Oh no, it says decrypting something using the transit secrets engine. Adil, feel free to explain this to us, right? The link's in the chat anyway, if anyone wants to check this out, right? So it looks like these are controls, integration test controls. Oh, I think I know this. Is this an inspect thing? There you go. Testing the Vault feature. Thank you. Just figured it out. So I just looked at the code in no context because we have moved past whatever we were talking about back then. So it looks like this is Chef Inspect, right? That you're using. Let me know in the chat. Right, there is another link which he has posted. So what do we have here? This looks like another, it is inspect, I thought so, right? This is another test that has been written. Is that not they're actually using Chef Inspect for anything like this? Because, you know, like I say, I know someone that's created a bespoke behavior-driven kind of testing, you know, using Gherkin syntax for policies. But in general, there's nothing really out of the box that's really good for testing Vault. So Inspect is kind of the thing that I've always thought about and said, yeah, that's probably the route I would go down, because a lot of things are done for you. Read the description. Where's the description? Here we go. So feature, so delegate member entity to auth module, successful deny. Okay, thank you very much. Let's go back to your last one. And the feature is the delegate member entity to auth module. Okay. Did I just click on the same link twice? I think I did. I think you posted the link twice. I don't know. Okay, so yeah, definitely check this out. If you'd like to speak to anyone about how you can implement testing strategies on Vault, I think it's quite clear to see that we have an expert in the chat. So give DevOps a Deal a follow. Reach out to him. He's part of, I think he's actually the lead implementation engineer at HashiCorp. Correct me if I'm wrong. But he's the person that is the genius when it comes to these kinds of things. So he's done some really, really, really good stuff in the past. Line 27, validate successful deny of encryption access. So this is this is like a test of a SAD path, right? You want to make sure that it's denying. This is pretty much like almost like behavior-driven design. Behavior-driven testing, but written in Ruby rather than Gherkin syntax, because what you're now testing is that certain things will actually happen. But yeah, we're at the hour now. I hope you found this useful. We will be back again next week. I didn't even get to look at some of my hybrid HCP Vault code, so we'll more than likely take a look at that next week, and we'll maybe look at some use cases of how we can leverage HCP Vault in more detail. So on that note, I'd like to say thank you very, very much for joining. It's been a blast as always. The chat has been lively. Testing the Vault ACRs. Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. You want to test your policies. That's the thing. Writing policies is hard, and you know, how do you know that your policies are doing the things that you need it to do and not opening other doors that you don't intend it to open, right? So it's tricky. So I think testing is key. So like I say, follow DevOps Adil. He's done some great work in this space, as he's been able to demonstrate here. But with that, I am going to bid you goodbye, and I will catch you next week, Tuesday, same time, for another Vault Brown Bag session. Thank you very much for joining. I'll see you next time.